Audio check. Good morning, everybody. It's time to make a start. I think everybody's here. Just a couple of matters before we go back to Mr. Saru. Mr. Morehouse, just to tell you, we've got your note.
Thank you,
we haven't really had time to digest, but we will do over lunch, I think, and come back to you.
So as you'll see, we're just trying to identify what your preference is as to the way that evidence is called so that it's convenient to the inquiry. Thank you.
Thank you.
So for what it's worth,
yes.
Having seen the note, I'm not going to take a point on it. If that's what Mr. Morehouse wants to do, fine.
That's helpful, thank you. Now then, just to help our consideration and preparation for the coming weeks, what we're looking for is a list of the operative conditions in relation to noise and air quality that the airport currently operates under, including any relevant section 106 clauses, obligations, that sort of thing. Mr. Taylor, would there be something the council would be able to lead on and then consult with the appellant and submit something to us, and we're thinking by next Tuesday evening would be helpful?
I'm sure we can do that.
Good. Fine. Okay, does anybody else in the room have any housekeeping issues before we start? Okay, in that case, we'll hand back over to Mr. Humphreys and continue his cross-examination of Mr. Saru.
Good morning again.
Good morning.
Mr. Saru, we were talking about business productivity and your balanced and optimistic approaches. This is your paragraph 4.3.11 and your table 4-3, which is on your page 25. And we discussed the balanced view and what that reflects, and we discussed the optimistic approach and what that reflects, and what it reflects is an adjustment to the business passenger growth rates from what York Aviation have forecast, which is broadly maintaining 14%, to a growth rate which is half that, as reflected in your table 4.2. And as we agreed, the effect of that would be to halve the benefits in terms of GVA, jobs and FTEs.
That's correct, yes.
And the corollary of that, obviously, is if the inspectors prefer our forecast for business growth, rather than the half rate that you've assumed, then your estimates for GVA, jobs and full-time equivalent for North Somerset, West of England and South West and Wales would be the same as ours?
They would be, yes.
Thank you. Now, your section 5 deals with direct employment impacts, but we can pass over that because that's now, we'll read, that's the data for GVA jobs, full-time equivalent for North Somerset, West of England and South West and Wales, and that's all now agreed. So
that's correct.
I think pleased to say, I think we just simply pass over that. And we get then to the topic of displacement, which you deal with in your section 6. And if we just start off with, before we go to the numbers, some sort of general, almost conceptual points on this. This is the concept, in effect, that if economic activity, GVA jobs, FTE, and so on, occurs in the future at the location of the airport in North Somerset, and obviously the indirect and induced employment more widely, based on growth at Bristol Airport, if it happens there in the future, then to some extent, we'll discuss to what extent, but to some extent it won't happen in the future. That growth won't happen somewhere else. That's the basic concept, isn't it?
That's correct, yes.
And the converse of that is that if it doesn't happen at Bristol, to some extent, we can discuss that, it will or it may happen somewhere else.
That's correct.
That principle, of course, that idea, and obviously the more widely you look, as I understand the concept, the wider the displacement or the greater the displacement would be. If you looked at this on a UK level or a global level, you'd say, well, you know, activity that doesn't happen in this particular area somehow will happen somewhere else, or some of it will.
That is the general principle, yes.
And of course that also applies to things like the Junction 21 development. If it didn't happen in North Somerset, but the same firms located to a similar site in, say, Daventry, then at a national level, there would be the same employment for UK PLC, but at a local level, there wouldn't be the employment in North Somerset.
It will depend on the differential productivity between the both locations, but you would expect that the difference would be relatively small, yes.
So, and we know, indeed, you told us about this, that the council positively encourages jobs to come to Junction 21 and many other locations in the borough, even in the knowledge that jobs that come there are displaced from elsewhere in the country, theoretically.
Theoretically, unless obviously they're FDI jobs.
Yes. You made a lot of points about displacement from North Somerset in the Bristol area going to Cardiff. We'll talk about that in principle, but there's no policy either locally or indeed nationally, is there, that Bristol Airport should not be able to expand in some way in order to benefit Cardiff Airport, which I think is owned by Welsh Government, isn't it? There's no policy that Bristol Airport Limited shouldn't be able to expand so that Cardiff Airport Limited or Cardiff Airport can expand.
No, there isn't.
Indeed, such a concept would probably pretty quickly attract the attention of the Competition and Markets Authority, be anti-competitive, wouldn't it, to deliberately be refusing permission for one company in order to benefit a competitor somewhere else.
I'm not familiar with the competition rules in this sort of area,
Yes.
so I couldn't really answer
Just
that
as
question.
a general principle, we can agree, can't we, though, that that would be anti-competitive. You would be stopping competition between the airports and seeking to favour one, use town and country planning rules to favour another airport.
No, in certain aspects, the competition authorities do have a view on this, and they get concerned about the market share of the dominant operator in an area, and do intervene in markets to break up
Yes.
what they perceive as monopolies. And as we've seen,
Yes, that
know,
was
the
in
OFT
relation to the
was-
London airport system, not Bristol.
no, that was, you were making a general point, and I was just
Ah.
following up with a general point. So there are, competition issues do come into it, but as I say, I'm not familiar with
No.
the rules and regulations to do with competition.
What we can both probably make very clear, can't we, to the inspectors is that there is no legal or policy reason why Bristol Airport should be constrained in terms of its capacity in order to favour either Cardiff or indeed any other airport.
That's correct, yes.
And although you point to some areas of deprivation in South Wales, as we agreed yesterday, there are also very clear areas of deprivation very close to Bristol Airport. Indeed, Bristol Airport's almost equidistant between two of the principal areas of deprivation in the southwest.
Yes, and we discussed the access issues as well associated with those.
Yes, but there are obviously, I think they may have not be operating to the full extent during the pandemic for obvious reasons, but there is normally public transport between those areas and the airport, and not everyone works on shifts, do they?
No, but there's still the regular, the frequency of the bus services is not particularly regular, and they do
Yes.
not serve some of the most deprived areas where people live, and
Yes.
they need to therefore travel some distance to access those public
Yes.
transport links.
But, Mr. Ciro, this is not particularly your area. Those people do access those services. People from those areas do work at the airport.
Certainly some do, yes.
Yes.
But the point is, if you don't have a car, then it becomes difficult to access those sites.
Yes. But people do.
Who haven't got a car?
They may have a car, they may not have a car. But you're not suggesting that no one from Weston-super-Mare or no one from South Bristol works at the airport?
No, certainly not.
Okay. Just turning to displacement forecasts, Mr. Brass makes the point, doesn't he, in his rebuttal, that there is no standard method for calculating displacement. You made very similar points yesterday.
That's correct.
And inevitably, these types of calculations are based on, again, I think point you made, multiple assumptions.
That's correct.
And the scale of any displacement, as we agreed a few moments ago, clearly depends on the area over which you try to examine displacement.
That's correct.
You made the point yesterday in relation to displacement that it is very uncertain as a concept.
Most economic terms are very uncertain.
But what we have agreed on, with Section 5 of your evidence, is the GVA jobs, the full-time equivalent jobs, in the district, sub-region, and the wider region, if the development does go ahead at Bristol Airport.
Yes.
Now let's look at some of your tables. So your table 6.1 is reporting the appellant's GVA jobs full-time equivalent data from the economic impact assessment addendum. You've taken them from two tables, no need for us to look at it, but table 36 and table, sorry, I think it's 3.6 and 3.7. And that's all now agreed.
In terms of, sorry, when you say what's, so you just clarify what's
Sorry,
agreed?
sorry, what is agreed is the GVA, the jobs, and the full-time equivalent data. Sorry, it's in fact not this table, it's another one that you produce later, but all of that base data is agreed, isn't it?
So the direct jobs, sorry,
Mr. Serro, I am slightly confusing you, I'm afraid. Maybe it's better if we look at one of the other tables. If we go back to your table 5.3, a couple of pages before, the top line there, the net impacts, the GVA, the jobs, the full-time equivalent over those different areas, that's what's all agreed in section 5, isn't it? The top line, the appellant's net impacts.
no, it's not. So what the top line is the appellant's net impacts. What we've agreed is the job intensity, which is the line 3, no longer applies. And, as we discussed, I think Mr. Taylor made a point, these are relatively small numbers and we accept your numbers. What we obviously don't agree on is the productivity impacts, where obviously we have a different view on those.
Okay. I'm very keen to make sure that there's no misunderstanding on what we've agreed. Table 5.2, the top line there, appellant's proposed development, GVA jobs, full-time equivalent, that is agreed.
That is agreed, yes.
Right, okay. And the productivity impacts, that's the point about what the business growth and business travelers would be. That's the line that represents your balanced and optimistic approach.
That's correct.
Right. So if we come on to displacement, and we look at your table at 6.3, we need to remember, don't we, in these tables, as we agreed yesterday, that there would need to be the correction to the numbers. Do you remember you produced earlier this week your errata based on a different job growth rate, and you corrected all of these tables, and I put it to you yesterday because you'd accepted the GVA, the jobs, and the full-time equivalent jobs. There would need to be a further correction. So we'll talk about this table in principle, if I can put it like that, without getting too hung up on the precise numbers. Would that be fair?
That's fair, yes.
And I think you said, and obviously you've had other things on your mind, but I think you said you would produce in due course an update to these tables. And
yes, we'll provide an update.
That would be helpful.
Set of tables.
But let's see what this shows. I think in the second column there, the one net additional impact from expansion, that's one of the ones where the numbers would be, because we've agreed now, would be slightly higher, I think.
They would be slightly higher. So I think, I'm not sure if it's helpful for people, but if you go back to table 5.3 and taking on board the point that some of these numbers are going to slightly change, but to sort of follow through the logic of where these come from. So on table 5.3, the Jacobs revised net impacts, which is the fourth line there, those numbers are the same numbers then that appear in that net additional impact from expansion on table
Yes.
6.3. So just to hopefully make it clear where these
So
numbers
those,
are coming from.
of course, those numbers reflect, so the numbers in your table 6.3 reflect both your adjustment on job intensity, which is now, we've agreed our positions, and also the reduction on productivity impacts, and where we've agreed on that is that that in a sense reflects a view on the growth of business passengers, and if it's half the growth rate we've assumed, then you would get half the benefits. If it's all the growth in business passengers we've assumed, you would get all the benefits, and we would be agreed.
That's correct.
So with those, and thank you, helpful caveats in mind, bearing in mind the figures will be slightly higher, even on an agreed basis now, this tells us, gives us your views on displacement. And we can see, for taking the top row of figures now, for North Somerset, we get a range there of impacts, jobs, GVA, and so on in North Somerset.
That's correct.
But if those jobs, so again, the figures will differ, but just so that we've got the principle, the 624 to the 555 jobs, if those did not happen in North Somerset, then we can see that 42 to 47 of them would happen in Cardiff. And then we can see that most of them would happen in Heathrow, Gatwick, Birmingham, Luton, or Stansted.
That's correct.
Actually, the final two columns there, aggregation, is quite useful, isn't it? So if the jobs are not provided, all those jobs not provided in North Somerset, 12% of them would go to somewhere else in the southwest or South Wales, but 88% of them would go to Heathrow, Gatwick, Birmingham, Luton, Stansted, most of them, as we can see, to the London area airports.
Yes, and the model, the logic model, which is always based, which obviously again there are caveats about that, would show this high level of displacement outside the area.
Yes. If one wants to take it slightly wider, west of England, you can see there, because of indirect and induced employment effects, you get higher job numbers in effect.
Yes.
Over the wider area. So we're still looking at the column net additional impact. So the airport would have these benefits if it's located at Bristol for the west of England. But if you don't expand the airport at Bristol, 13% of it would go to Cardiff, 1% to Bournemouth, so 14%. And then I think there's a slight error in the numbers in the final two columns, because it's 13 and 1, I think, for study area. It doesn't really matter, 14%.
It's rounding issues.
Just not a problem. I'm pointing it out just so that we're not misleading ourselves. But again, the vast majority of it, 87% of all those jobs that would be happening in the west of England, 87%, 86%, whatever it is, now would happen at Heathrow, Gatwick, Birmingham, Luton, Stansted.
That's correct.
It's only, isn't it, when we move the we move the study area to be really, really wide, South West and South Wales, which obviously includes Cardiff, where the effects of expansion at Bristol are again much higher in terms of the numbers of jobs. So it's not, we can see how much North Somerset gains, we can see how much the West of England gains, but that expansion at Bristol, once one looks more widely, actually produces thousands more jobs in the much wider area, doesn't it?
It does, yes.
But even then, yes, because we've widened the area to include South Wales, 28% of people would go from Cardiff, 4% from Newquay, 17% from Exeter, and 3% from Bournemouth, which is 52%. But again, 48%, again, it's about 50-50, 48% of those jobs would simply go to outside the study area, Heathrow, Gatwick, Birmingham, Luton, and Stansted.
That's correct, and you know, as you say, with the Cardiff and Exeter, it shows the overlap of the catchment areas of Bristol Airport, principally with those two other airports.
And as we agreed earlier, there's nothing, is there, in law or policy that indicates that Bristol Airport shouldn't expand to bring those very considerable numbers of jobs to North Somerset, West of England, and South West and South Wales, rather than deliberately constraining the airport's capacity in order to force a very large proportion of those jobs to completely different parts of the country. There's no policy driver for that, is there?
No, there isn't.
Indeed, quite the opposite. Regional policy, we kind of touched on some of these things. I tried not to be tiresome about it by going through all of it. I went through rather more of it with Mr. Foley. But once one looks at regional and local policy, the policy is very much to encourage jobs to come to the South West and indeed also North Somerset, isn't it?
Yeah, the policy is, you know, the levelling up agenda is to support more deprived areas, and they are spread throughout the southwest of England.
And that would include North Somerset.
That includes parts of North Somerset, as we said.
You see, levelling up applies to those areas in the southwest, west of England as well, doesn't it?
Yes.
Can we just remind ourselves what the officers said about this? Can you have CD 411? Because they dealt with this, they gave their views. And get you to turn to PDF page 19. And just give you a chance to sort of orientate yourself within it, but the officers looking at passenger numbers at other airports. The first paragraph under the table there just talks about passenger leakage and those sorts of concepts, but it's the next paragraph I just want to touch on.
Sorry, sir, can you speak up the microphone?
I'm sorry. Let me try and do this. The second paragraph under the table says the same factors that cause passenger displacement to airports outside regions is likely also to apply to airports within the same region. But then there is nothing in aviation or planning policy which suggests that there should be a more equitable balance of airport capacity within regions to prevent a so-called imbalance in the scale or commercial pull of different airports. That's right, isn't it?
It is, yes.
And therefore, when looking at this issue of displacement and whether in some way less weight should be applied to jobs and job creation in North Somerset, west of England and so on, the inspectors need to bear in mind, isn't it, that there's a very strong policy theme that jobs should be created here, and there is absolutely no policy, is there, that they should be displaced.
Sorry, I missed the end of the question, what the actual question was.
Perhaps I didn't word it well. When the inspectors are looking at the issue of displacement, and if permissions refused here where jobs, where growth might go, they need to view that, don't they, within the context, the prism of understanding that there is strong policy support for job growth within the southwest and indeed North Somerset.
Yeah, I think that the whole point of displacement is really about understanding the net economic impacts of the scheme. The issue of where the activity goes to is an issue for consideration, but it's also looking at what the net impact of the scheme and the net benefits that are being claimed by the scheme.
But what your own table 6.3 makes very clear to us is that the net impacts at the local level are very positive.
There are positive benefits at the local level, yes.
Yes, and the disbenefits, if that growth is not allowed, in fact, much on your table of the economic benefit goes completely outside the study area. It goes to the London area airports.
It does, yes.
And the point I was putting to you is there is strong regional and policy support to encourage job growth within the region and the district. Yes?
Yes.
And there is no policy support that should be discouraged in order to force jobs to Heathrow, Gatwick, Birmingham, Luton or Stansted areas.
That's correct.
Thank you. Now, section 7 of your evidence looks at a number of different points, and one of the first of them is in section 7.2, this is contribution to the local economy, that you assert, but so far as I can see with no evidence, that most of the jobs are likely to be low value and low skilled posts. But we agreed yesterday, didn't we, that for those hundreds of jobs, for the people taking them, for those individuals, the jobs are clearly better than what they were doing before.
So one, I didn't assert, I just quoted back the appellant's views of what the nature of the jobs were. So it's the appellant's views, not mine, that they require basic skills. And yes, we agreed yesterday, if people take jobs there, it's because that's their free choice, and presumably it was better than any alternative was available to them.
Yes, and that will be because either the job pays more or it's a job that people prefer. I don't know, cabin crew, people like the idea of that type of job, or they weren't employed or they were underemployed. Whatever it is, people take those jobs and will take those jobs because it's good for them. It's better for them, for their families.
Sure.
And then section 8 is on, I'm passing over certain things because either they've been superseded or frankly they don't ultimately make very much difference. You know, there may be slight differences between us. Section 8, uncertainty, and you there point to Brexit. Of course, non-tariff barriers, which you spoke about yesterday, have been known about for some time, haven't they?
They have, but we don't seem to be very well adapting to them.
Yes, but they will be reflected, won't they, in the economic growth forecasts?
Well, this is where it gets interesting in terms of, you know, do we become a global Britain and the growth happens in other parts?
Yes.
So you may have impacts.
Not really asking about that. You remember, yesterday or the day before, I can't remember, Mr. Brass made the point that the economic growth forecast on which he had relied took into account Brexit, and therefore non-tariff barriers are already reflected, aren't they, in the forecasts?
If they have an impact on the economics.
If they had an impact on the economics, exactly. And therefore, that type of uncertainty is already, to use a colloquial phrase, baked in to the data, isn't it?
Only to the extent where it has an impact on economic growth. You know,
Yes.
There are other aspects of Brexit which may not impact on economic growth and therefore are not reflected in the level of uncertainty that might occur.
But we're dealing with the economics. And the other things that the inspectors need to note is that insofar as those things have an effect or do not have an effect, that exists both in the with expansion world and the without expansion world.
It does, yes.
There's no net difference between the two, is there?
No.
Then outbound tourism. And you seek to include this. You say 8.3.6, you identify an annual negative impact of 123 million. But people that go on holiday, they don't just stay at home and give their money to people in foreign resorts, do they? They get something for it. They're buying something.
They are, yes.
And for those people, they wouldn't be buying that thing unless it had at least that value to them.
That's correct.
It may actually have a greater value. I might buy a family holiday for, for however long, for £5,000, but because that's the most wonderful thing and I'm going to a part of the world that I'm really keen to see, that might have huge value for me, social value.
It could do, yes.
And your paragraph 8.3.3 makes, as I understand it, a point that you're making, that appraisal ought to take into account the social value of the thing being bought.
Yes.
Well, what value have you attributed to these holidays?
So what's the alternative would you spend that money on, and what benefit would you get from that? And the methodologies of producing that.
What value have you attributed? You've said that people are spending that amount of money on holidays. Do we put 250 million on that as the social benefit to them?
So one would argue that the amount you spend on the holiday is the benefit you receive, because that's the way in economics we associate benefits that we receive. We pay £1 for a Mars bar, £1.50 for a pint of beer, that's the
That's why,
relativities. And
that's
therefore
why I
that's the
asked you
benefits
to
we get from
agree
it.
just now, which you did, that you would pay, you would at least get that value. As I put to you, I might pay £5,000 for the holiday, but for me it's worth far more than that. Time with my family, quality time, perhaps not working. Those are all really important things, aren't they?
And there are benefits to you that you valued at £5,000. If you couldn't do that, you may have spent that
Yes.
£5,000 on something else, or they would
Exactly.
have given you a different set of benefits.
And
which would
therefore,
have been equal to
when
that.
you talk about the 123 million in your paragraph 8.3.6, we need to understand, don't we, that that needs to be netted off to zero, because for the reasons you have just given, it is at least equivalent to the value people place on it.
No, because you then need to compare it with what the alternative would be and what they would spend that money on and what benefit they would receive from that.
Yes, we're assuming they do spend the money on that. As you tell us in the Green Book, when they spend the money on that, you also need to understand the public value based on principles of welfare economics and concerns for social welfare efficiency, not simply, as you seem to be stating, simply economic market efficiency. So it's important, isn't it, the inspectors understand, as I put it right at the outset, people aren't just giving their money to people in a resort, they're buying something which they value.
They are buying something which they value, and if they weren't doing that, they would be spending their money on something else which they also value.
Yes. And there is no, so far as I'm aware, no policy in the UK that people should not be able to buy holidays. We don't discourage foreign travel, do we, in the UK to in some way improve the balance of payments or our economic welfare or anything of that sort?
In general terms, no, but we do impose air passenger duty, which does have a dampening effect on travel. But you know, as we've said as I said in the proof, we're not saying that we should stop people from travelling. We're not suggesting there should be any constraints on people travelling. All we're saying is that, you know, a full assessment of the costs and benefits should be taken into consideration.
Okay, but clearly, if one was conducting some sort of cost-benefit analysis, it's not fair or not appropriate, is it, to just take into account the cost of the holiday? One would also need to take into account the social benefit of the holiday on your basis and monetize that.
Yes, just as you would take into account the social benefits of alternative what you would spend the money on. It's not appropriate just to ignore it. You know, we've set out an assumptions of how you could put a value on it. You've raised, you know, perfectly fair issues that you could also need to take into consideration, which may have an impact on it. But it comes back to this point of there is a disbenefit there. This is an economic assessment, and we need to consider both the benefits and disbenefits.
And the point I've put to you is you've considered the disbenefit, but not the benefit, and I think we've agreed on that.
But I'm not sure we have, because I said there's an alternative you would spend your money on, which would give you a series of social benefits, and what you need
Mr.
to then
Zero,
understand is the marginal differences between those two expenditure patterns.
But with respect, I'm not interested in the alternative. We're not building, you know, a Zanussi refrigerator factory here. It's expanding an airport. People are going to go on holidays. I'm putting to you that that has a social benefit that people put a value on, and that that's an important thing to understand when you say that there is a cost of those holidays.
Well, with respect, we are
it?
looking at alternatives. That's the whole point of an economic assessment. You're looking at the impact of doing something against an impact of doing nothing. You're very clearly looking at alternatives.
All right. Now, again, carbon impacts, which is a topic you just touch on very briefly. Obviously, the different forecasts, as I discussed with Mr. Foley and as was discussed with Mr. Brass, reflect through the modelling costs of carbon, both in the core case forecast and on average higher costs in the slower growth forecasts, and therefore the costs of carbon are internalised, aren't they, in the forecasts?
Sorry, run back past me again.
Yes, the costs of carbon are already internalised in the forecast, because by including those costs, the demand levels are slightly lower than they would have been. And therefore, it would be double counting, in effect, wouldn't it, to both reduce demand because of the price of carbon costs, and then in some way at the end take on board carbon costs again.
So I'm not familiar with the details of the model, and the question arises as to what price of carbon has been used.
Of course, it does. But the principle is correct, isn't it? Subject to your point about what price, the principle is a correct one.
Sorry, I'm trying to get my head around I'm not familiar with how the price of carbon has been applied into the model.
If you're not familiar, then, we're not going to try and explain it to each other, but the inspectors just need to note that, don't they, in relation to your section 8.5, where you make points about carbon costs.
So these are the appellant's numbers. They have netted off the price of carbon. So either you're saying that yourselves have double counted something and these numbers are wrong, or we're saying that the price of carbon has not been fully included in the assessment. So I'm not...
What I'm trying to put to you is that, yes, we've produced figures, but they are internalised to the forecast.
The price of carbon would have an impact on demand.
Yes.
But then there's also, how that is accounted for in the economics and how that's included in the economics.
Okay. Just then to draw to a conclusion on these things and see if we can see what remains by way of difference. So in relation to your section 5, jobs, the two parties, the Council, your evidence and ours, we're completely in agreement.
Correct.
In relation to business productivity and our figures versus your figures, the real difference between us is the growth rates in business passengers, which I cross-examined Mr. Foley about.
That's correct.
In relation to displacement, we've looked at various figures. We've recognized, both of us in fairness, that there is a deal of uncertainty about those things, but insofar as we have figures for those sorts of things, we've seen that certainly at the local and west of England level, displacement of jobs and GVA would very largely, 88%-ish, go to outside the study area.
That's correct.
We've agreed also in that context that there is no policy that Bristol and North Somerset should not be able to compete for jobs and GVA in order to displace it to anywhere else.
That's correct.
And in terms of outbound tourism, we've certainly agreed that outbound tourism will have an economic cost, the amount of money paid, but that there is also a social benefit, and that it's appropriate to take that into account.
It is.
Mrs. Sirro, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Taylor?
Thank you. Mr. Sirro, carbon impacts. You were asked some questions about it, and it was put to you that carbon pricing has been internalised into the demand forecast, but in response you said that it's how it's accounted for in the economics that you were concerned with. Can you just elaborate on that to just explain a bit more what the concerns are about the economic impact assessment and carbon prices that you have?
So what we have is, from any sort of transport project, there is an increased level of carbon usually if it's a road or an aviation system. And under economic appraisals, that value of carbon is valued using the Department for Transport or BES's values for carbon. And again, there's a lot of uncertainty about what the price of carbon should be. And the DFT guidance is now that we should be using the high values of carbon.
Right, and in terms of what has been done in the economic impact assessment produced by or on behalf of Bristol Airport Limited in this case, you've said in your evidence it's unclear how these carbon costs have been monetised.
So we don't know what the value of carbon has been used. So one of the differences in between the MPVs and the CD208 and CD222 is that carbon wasn't priced in the first one, it was priced in the second one, but we don't know what the price of carbon that was used in that.
Okay. All right, thank you. Now, your carbon section, it's paragraph 9.1.12. You also make the point that noise and air quality impacts have not been assessed in the economic case. So what, and you say all three of these environmental impacts should be included in the core CBA. Again, just explain, please, when we bring all those three together, what's the point that you're making? What's the consequence for the economic impact assessment that's being produced?
So for all transport appraisals, we should be valuing, there's a methodology for monetizing noise, changes in noise and changes in air quality. And we would expect to see those valuations to be put in that MPV calculation. So the appellants have moved to put in the price of carbon, as we can see that's a significant number. We don't know what the numbers that would be associated with noise and air quality.
Thank you. Now, you were asked some questions in the context of displacement about policy and whether there was any policy which indicated that displacement should be encouraged to shift jobs elsewhere than Bristol, North Somerset, West of England, etc. Now, I'm going to put it another way to you. What policy is there that Hillingdon, Uttlesford and Crawley should not be able to compete for the economic activity that we're discussing in this particular case?
So there is no policy that prevents any competition with those other airports and locations?
Right. So what policy is there that indicates that growth at Bristol, West of England, North Somerset, the South West and South Wales is to be preferred over growth at any other part of the UK? What policy is there?
There is no policy of...
Right. In terms of the levelling up agenda, you explained yesterday in your evidence in chief that the levelling up fund is allocated on a particular basis, with local authorities being ascribed particular levels. I think you explained from 1 to 3.
That's correct.
And from my recollection, your evidence was that Cardiff was level 1.
That's correct.
But the 4 authorities in the West of England area, 3 of them were level 2 and 1 was level 3, is that right?
That is correct.
Okay. So, in terms of the levelling up agenda, bearing in mind the discussion we've just had about competition between areas, in your view, what supports the levelling up agenda looked at in that way by a local authority area better? Granting permission for the proposed expansion at Bristol Airport or refusing it?
Refusing it.
Thank you. Yeah. Now, just to follow up the point that was put about displacement to you by my learned friend, and so we can understand what Mr. Brass's position is on displacement. If you could take out CD 222, which is the economic impact assessment addendum, and turn into that to PDF page 17. I think you've got the hard copy, so it's page 14. And paragraph 332, the assessment explains, in this particular case, the geography of the study areas is also a relevant consideration. Product displacement is only potentially an issue in relation to one of the 3 study areas being assessed, and that is the broadest geographical area, the South West and South Wales, as there are no alternative airports in either North Somerset or the West of England. It's not therefore a relevant issue in considering the local or sub-regional impacts of the proposed development. You see that?
I do, yes.
And then we see the reference to the 28% passenger demand displacement that comes out of the logic model. And of course, we've already made clear the caveat about that. 334, we can see that it goes on to explain the effects of displacement. At the very end of that, it explains that, again, it should be remembered that this adjustment does not affect North Somerset or the West of England study areas.
Yes.
So when Mr. Brass produces his adjustment, what adjustments does he make for North Somerset and the West of England?
He doesn't make any.
Right. Okay, we can explore that with him. I think probably next week, certainly, by the looks of it. Now, I've got very little left for you, I think. Yes, right at the start of the cross-examination, Mr. Ciro, you asked a number of questions about various bits of aviation policy. Now, we know that we're going to be hearing from Mr. Gertler later at this inquiry. Who of the witnesses called on behalf of the council addresses the weight to give to aviation policy?
I see, that's Mr. Gertler.
Right. And so, what views, if any, do you express on the weight to give to aviation policy that the inspector should rely on?
None.
Thank you. Sir, thank you. That's the re-examination.
Okay, we'll have a 20-minute break. Can we get the next witness set up, Mr. Morehouse? Are you going to move down, or?
I was intending to stay here unless
Right.
there was a difficulty. I can see everyone clearly from
It
here.
might be easier to move down here and have...
Sorry, if it's acceptable, I'm going to be disappearing, and Mr.
Oh.
Henderson's going to be looking after the fort, as it were, and so Mr. Morehouse can certainly come and sit here because I won't be here.
Is that okay? I'd rather have you down here. I can see you a bit better.
Thank you.
You can even try my special chair if you want.
Right, okay, let's take a 20-minute break, then we'll come back at 10 to 11. Thank you, everybody. Inquiry is now resumed. Just a couple of quick points before I hand over to Mr. Morehouse. Mr. Morehouse will reissue the programme for next week.
Thank you.
We'll tweak that just to get your witness involved.
Just to say, I've gone off the timing estimates provided by you both and just halved it. Yeah, so just for noise, and then coming back sort of August or September, won't it, for highways and Greenbelt?
For my part, I'm very happy with that. I think I've overestimated assuming that I may need to do more, and I think events are happily proving otherwise.
Okay.
Yes, I think on my estimates so far, I have actually been pretty much on every estimate. I think for the first witness, I think I said 2.5 hours to 3, and I was 2.5 hours. But I've tried to bear in mind your injunctions to be at the bottom end of ranges or below ranges, so I'll review everything.
Okay, thank you. I mean, I think for Ms. Byrne, you said 45 minutes to an hour, so I've put thinking 30 minutes at this stage, but...
Yes, the message is absolutely well understood, and as long as you are understanding that it may therefore mean that one can't quite cover everything that one would have, then that's fine. Yeah,
I mean, it's looking, noise is sort of quite busy next week now because we've lost a day to the Tuesday, but we'll figure something out, I'm sure.
Yeah.
And secondly, just on Tuesday, you'll be aware we have Mr. Brass coming back on Tuesday. Now, one of the inspectors will be here.
Yes.
I'll be sort of leading again, but I won't be here. I'll be virtual.
Yep.
So will Mr. Brass. We're just putting the feelers out as to who's actually going to be coming in here physically.
I was intending to be here physically. I mean, I just frankly don't know whether, if you told me, look, it makes it easier if I'm virtual as well, I can go and sit in a room. I'll be here, but I can go and sit in a room and be virtual.
It makes no difference
easier.
to me.
I think this works quite well, to be frank. So as long as you're happy with that, then yes, I'll be here.
And on the other side, Mr. Henderson, is your team going to be here?
Yes, that's correct, sir. Both Mr. Taylor and myself will be here.
Okay, sort of. Fine. Okay. Mr. Morehouse, do you want to introduce your witness?
Thank you. Do you want to just turn your microphones on so we can hear you? Thank you. It's Dr. Alex Chapman, and you are here in the capacity of being a specialist in policy impact analysis and evaluation.
That's correct.
You have a Bachelor of Science degree in environmental economics and a doctorate from the University of Southampton focused on socio-economic evaluation of infrastructure proposals and their climate impacts.
That's correct.
There has been some comment about your experience prior to you giving evidence. I wonder if you can just assist with your expertise and the fields that you've worked in, please.
Certainly. So I spent 6 years working at the University of Southampton. During that time, I was conducting socioeconomic modelling, evaluation on infrastructure projects, including as well forecasting forward impacts, but with a particular focus on the way that climate change would impact on the performance and the socio-economic impacts of those interventions. That included quite a lot of work internationally. So initially I was focused in Vietnam, looking at infrastructure issues around dikes and dams there. And during that period, I was making use of techniques like Monte Carlo simulation to forecast forwards how these interventions would play out in the local economies. And during that period, I gave policy briefings to members of the Vietnamese government. I then spent another 2 years in a postdoctoral position doing pretty similar stuff in Bangladesh, where again, I conducted modelling and impact assessment around their strategies to invest in infrastructure for economic growth, but also to protect against climate impacts. And I again, fed that through work funded by the Department for International Development, fed that into policymakers in Bangladesh. As a result of those experiences, I was taken on as an international consultant by the Asian Development Bank, and I've had contracts with them on and off for the last 5 years. My roles for ADB include supporting them with understanding the socioeconomic risks and interpreting the risks that come from climate modelling and how that intersects with their infrastructure investment plans. Obviously, ADB, along with the other multilateral development banks, do vast amounts of infrastructure investment, less so, admittedly, in airports, more so in roads and similar.
Thank you. There was also, I think, an observation made about your, or comment made about your experience with airports.
Yeah.
Can you just briefly just give us an indication of that, please?
Sure. So I've been at New Economics Foundation for 3.5 years, and during that time I've predominantly worked on airports. My experience includes analysis on the third runway proposed at Heathrow, the expansion of Leeds Bradford airports, those two commissioned by groups opposing the expansion of those airports. I was, along with colleagues, contracted by Eastleigh Borough Council to support them in reviewing the expansion proposals at Southampton airports, and obviously have been involved in the Bristol expansion since our first submission to the planning application consultation a couple of years ago.
Thank you. I just want to, just in case it becomes relevant, just deal with we've heard a lot about Monte Carlo assessment tool, forecasting tool. We've heard about it being described as a black box which data is put in and comes out. What has your direct experience been with using Monte Carlo simulation?
Yeah, so I used Monte Carlo simulation to look at different scenarios for how climate impacts might affect socioeconomic outcomes when I was working in Vietnam. It is unfortunately certainly the case that models like Monte Carlo simulations can be a black box. They can be highly technical and involve issues like statistical probability in their interpretation. We can come back to this later, but yeah, I do have some experience in that area.
And is that in the sense of setting up such testing or simply looking at the output from those tests?
I created a model and ran it myself.
Thank you. I just want to now turn to your actual evidence and paragraph 2 of your proof of evidence, which is to do with the economic appraisal methodology. I think in your proof of evidence you make reference to the HM Treasury's Green Book and also tag analysis. Do you want to explain your appreciation of the relevance of those?
Certainly. I don't think I need to tell everyone, obviously, the importance of what we're doing here, and particularly the relevance of the economic issues to this decision. My understanding is that and I'm not a planning expert, that's not my area, but I'm setting the context for what I'm about to say. My understanding is that making best use of existing runways policy very clearly delegates responsibility to local authorities to make a decision on the relative merits of airport expansion around economic and environmental issues. We are, of course, in a climate crisis, and in that context, additionally confounded by the pandemic, it is absolutely imperative that we have the highest quality economic analysis with which to make our decision. And the best practice standard in economic appraisal in the government's eyes is set out in the Green Book and the Transport Analysis Guidance. Now, I am, again, in reading the guidance around these documents, I am somewhat confused as to why the Department for Transport's Transport Analysis Guidance is not thus far in the inquiry been treated as the preeminent document against which we should be assessing the quality of the proposals.
And what makes you say that?
Well, the in stating when tag should be used, the government states that projects or studies that require government approval are expected to make use of this guidance. Now, as I understand it, the local authority and the planning inspectorate are arms of government making a decision on this, this scheme. Of additional relevance, of course, is the fact that this scheme does involve much investment from the public sector, not necessarily directly in the infrastructure at the airport, but in the supporting infrastructure, for example, around the road network around the airport, likely to require tens of millions of pounds in investment. And I understand North Somerset Council have indicated that some of that funding, at least, would come from the Department of Transport. Additionally, we do need to consider the other forms of investment, if you like, by the public and the government. So if you have a scheme that has a significant carbon impact, we can cost that carbon impact through standard and accepted methods. If there is no way of specifically drawing down the costs or recouping them from the private investor, as is currently the case, the government is effectively subsidising aviation with free carbon allowances. That is effectively an investment within a carbon-capped world. That is an investment that has a cost to the public sector. So I see this decision as one that is relevant in that regard to tag. However, moving additionally in this area, I've seen challenges in Mr. Brass's rebuttal that tag is even best practice in this area, never mind whether or not it is required. There are additional quotes very clearly spelled out, and I've tried to detail this in very accurately in my rebuttal, that the Department for Transport consider tag to be the best practice guide.
So your position is you understand that tag ought to be applied, if not, it's best practice.
Yes.
Move on to the next subject. Why is that significant to this inquiry? If tag had been applied in this case, what difference would it have made?
There's quite a number of ways in which the appraisal put forward by the appellant would be deficient in the eyes of tag. And some of them are particularly important when you consider the context of the uncertainty provided by the pandemic. The ones I would highlight are the sensitivity testing and the extent to which this, the proposal or the economic impact addendum and subsequent proofs have not sensitivity tested anything effectively in the economic assessment. And that, my reading of tag suggests that would not be acceptable. Additional issues are around carbon pricing, as we've heard before. The incorrect carbon prices appear to have been applied. There is no distributional impact assessment, as I understand would be expected under tag. I expect a larger appraisal geography assessment would have been required, and monetisation of air quality and noise impacts.
And so far as the initial documents that were submitted by the appellant, did they deal with those effectively as they would under proper tag analysis in your assessment?
No.
If we can move on then to the question of sensitivity testing. You've already mentioned issues around uncertainty and the pandemic. Yeah. I wonder if you can help us with just an overview of your evidence in relation to that.
I've drawn out a number of quotes in my proof which highlight the importance of sensitivity testing in the Green Book and in tag. Just to draw one out from that, I would highlight particularly the most recent updates to tag, which were released in 2020 subsequent to the pandemic, which is in the tag route map and also available online on the website via the link that I've provided in my proof. The tag route map, I just wanted to flag, I'm not sure if that ended up making its way onto the core document list. I don't know how that's happened, but it has always been there, referenced in my proof and quoted from in my proof. Okay. We can circulate that.
You've quoted directly from it in your proof, so there's nothing in there that isn't sourced and already before the inquiry.
Indeed. Now that quote highlights quite clearly that in this context of extra uncertainty, sensitivity testing just gets even more important to us being able to appraise a decision. So if we look at what has been put forward by the appellant. We have a degree of sensitivity testing in the forecasts, which is the low and higher growth scenarios that we've discussed already. Although I do have concerns around those scenarios, how they've been arrived at, which we may come back to later. But the core point is that all that happens is the core scenario is the only one that progresses in any way meaningfully into the economic assessment. We have one single view of the future, a view which in many respects was actually constructed prior to many of the pandemic impacts, but also contains with it many economic parameters which are pivotal to producing the appellant's numbers, which are highly uncertain and have not been subjected to any testing.
So what factors are those that ought to have been included, do you think?
So I've raised concerns, and we'll probably come back to this, but around issues like the job productivity of the airport, which will have been massively impacted by the pandemic. That is evident in recent developments. I'll come back to that. The other issue is the relationship between business travel and the actual productivity gain that we get, which again has been impacted by the pandemic. We've got issues around outbound tourism, which have been effectively ignored by the appellant, which could have been put through some scenario analysis. So running throughout the case, there is an absence of any testing. Now, just to add to that, if you were to look at a Department for Transport assessment of a transport scheme similar to this, you would very rarely see them pinning to one single number on uncertain issues like business impacts. They would usually give you a range. And that's a point that Mr. Saroy was making earlier, and I'm just reinforcing, really.
Okay. So if we just go to paragraph 3.3, just to recap on that subject, what do you think is missing from the sensitivity testing?
So I think I listed most of the issues here. The one that I think I forgot on my list just now was obviously the carbon costing as well, which is, I shouldn't have forgotten it because it's arguably the most important of the lot. Of course, the context has also changed there quite recently with the recent developments, and that shows with the Transport Decarbonisation Plan and the Jet Zero consultation exactly why parameters like carbon costing should have been subjected to a greater range of testing, both within the forecasting context where the prices were input into the forecasting model, but also in the social cost of carbon, which is included in the economic assessment, which has no range around it.
Now, just dealing with that forecasting model, there was some evidence given a few days ago about the use of the Monte Carlo assessments and the ability to be more granular in the analysis of the output from that assessment. Do you have any observations in relation to that?
So we are, in relation to that model, we are still lacking a lot of information about exactly what has gone on there. We know that 1,000 runs were made of a model which has varying inputs with different levels of probability assigned to them. I believe the total number of combinations, if you like, that could have been run is something in the tens of thousands. Now, what you get from that output is a huge sort of mess arguably, of combinations where you might have had one carbon price matched up against a certain oil price and a certain GDP growth rate and things like that. Now, the main concern which I heard in, I think it was Lizbeth's cross-examination of Mr. Brass, is that we can't really tell how the low and the high growth scenarios were actually selected from those 1,000 runs that were made. Was it the worst? Is the slow growth the worst scenario and the high growth the best? Or was it, what was the basis for that? But on top of that, can we actually see what the assumptions were within those scenarios? So we now know that high carbon prices are the, effectively the default assumption. High carbon prices were only weighted probability-wise in the Monte Carlo simulation with 12.5%. Central carbon prices had 75%. So the probability that we would arrive at a central carbon price scenario, apologies, is much, much higher. So I'd like to know, does the slow growth scenario did it use high carbon prices? And of course the issue is that even if it did use high carbon prices, the other parameters that were also being varied in the simulation may have been much more favorable. What we needed is a controlled experiment where you held all of the other assumptions constant, and you tested what a high carbon price then does to the model, because only then can you truly learn the impact. And we don't have enough information, and we don't have that scenario in front of us. As I understand it, that is the scenario that the Department of Transport are asking for in their recent guidance around using high carbon prices.
Thank you. I want to move on then, if we can, to the paragraph 4 in your proof of evidence, which is the appropriate geographical area used in the evidence submitted.
Indeed. So the largest geographical extent we have in the economic assessment is the Southwest and South Wales. I mean, there's an argument that that is an effectively arbitrary designation of borders. I mean, why did we draw the line there? I mean, it's historic reasons, I suppose. It's the legacy.
You've said there's an argument. Is there a reason why you would choose a wider geographical area?
Yes, absolutely. Now, first of all, I would highlight the Department of Transport's guidance on this, which says, when estimating the complete extent of additionality, i.e., are the benefits we're seeing actually new benefits, or are they just relocated? Scheme promoters should choose and consider a large enough geographical area to capture fully the behavioural responses of households and firms at the national level. Now, we know that a lot of the behavioural responses that we're expecting to see in this proposed expansion relate to London airports. But London airports are outside of our maximum study appraisal extent. And what we see is that creates kind of issues in terms of exactly figuring out which benefits are new and which benefits are just being displaced around. And this feeds through into the displacement issue. For example, if you have inbound tourists coming into the southwest area, but they're coming in via a London airport, we have this issue that they're, under the current presentation by the appellant, those appear to be treated as if they're new inflows into the area because they're, sort of activity that comes in from London. But of course, the spending that they make, which is on their hotel in Newquay or here in Weston-super-Mare, has not changed location. Now, I think in Mr. Brass's rebuttal, to be fair, there are, there's issues there like, maybe they'd stay overnight in London when they land. So it's not going to be a full assessment, a full transfer. If they did fly straight to Bristol Airport, then arguably a bit more of the money is retained within the southwest. But the bulk of the spending of that inbound tourist coming to the southwest doesn't really matter if they come via a London airport or via Bristol. But because of the way the appraisal geographies have been lined up and the way it's been and then been modelled by the appellant, that's being treated as a new inflow to the area. And that, I think, is why, if we'd had a larger appraisal study extent at a top level which considered London, I've said ideally national, why not do national? Climate change is a national issue, but we can debate that. That would have elucidated, that would have made a lot more of this kind of assessment a lot easier.
I just want to invite your attention to paragraph 4.13, 4.14 of your proof. And I wonder whether you can help us with a bit more, by way of example, of the application of what you've just been discussing. 4.13 and 4.14, sorry.
So I think in 4.13, I'm just addressing what the appellant's justification for their choice of study area was, which seemed to relate to the origins of the passengers departing from within the South West region and South Wales. But the point that I suppose I'm making is, yes, but they fly from London airports, and that means that the London's part of London system is within the scope of this assessment. Specifically in 4.14, when a stated objective of this scheme is the clawback, if you like, of passengers that were going via London through the south into Bristol Airport. So if that's your stated objective, surely those airports that you're aiming to claw back from should be within scope of assessment.
Thank you. Now, 4.15, I think a continuation, probably looking at the same issue slightly differently.
Yeah, so we're now getting into the kind of displacement issues. So, we've talked about this before, and most are probably familiar now, but we have three groups of passengers in this proposed expansion. We have the group who are going to be displaced from airports within the current regional study assessment, which is 28% according to the appellant. We have the group that are going to be displaced from out of region areas, which is 34%-ish, which equates to around 700,000 passengers. Again, highlighting the size of that number highlights why I think the appraisal geography should have been larger. And then we have the remaining 38% who are the group who are newly travelling. Now, those numbers I'm taking from the appellant's own displacement modelling. We've not conducted our own displacement modelling, so I don't pass comment on whether those, or I've seen, Jacobs have had their own estimates. I make no judgment as to whether those are correct or not. I'm simply taking those numbers and saying, let's play this out to its conclusion and see where it takes us.
Okay. And in relation to, by not including the wider geographical area, what's your observation about the reliability of the assessments?
I think it's created significant reliability issues, particularly around the inbound tourism estimates and the business productivity estimates. Yeah.
No, I think you at 4.16 talk about guidance on this particular subject.
Yeah. So there's this peak economics report that was produced for the Department for Transport. Can I just get the CD number for that? CD 11.46. Now, this document, as I say, was part of the evidence preparations the Department for Transport was making around 2018 ahead of its major policy announcements at the time. And the report looks at specifically regional connectivity issues. The authors, I believe, are relatively well-esteemed researchers in the transport economics world, and I think they're based at the University of Leeds. Now, this is obviously advice that was given to government, not government policy, I recognise that, but I found this report extremely useful in guiding us as to how we should go about appraising regional airport expansions. In recognising that TAG, for example, deals with a lot of different transport projects, so a little bit of additional information can help. And that report highlights three what they sort of see as key tests for understanding regional airport expansion. Those are to understand displacement and to truly understand how much of the proposed benefits are actually being newly created. And they raise concerns about the idea that a lot of sort of more regionalised expansions can end up fighting other local regional airports for capacity rather than challenging the centre, London, in our case. And therefore, if not treated extremely carefully, we can end up overstating the amount of benefit. The second two are key tests are around business productivity. So is there actually any new business activity that will be created by this expansion? And we've heard a lot about that, but I think it's really important, especially given the reliance of the appellant in their assessment on the business productivity impacts, equating to something like 40-45% of their claims benefits. And the third test around the net balance of inbound and outbound tourism, which is again incredibly relevant here in Bristol. Bristol's case, where we have an airport that is, in the vast majority of its business, is with outbound international leisure passengers. Just a few key points there that I return to in the remaining parts of my proof.
And so, just looking at the appropriate geographical area, your assessment of the approach taken on behalf of the appellant, what conclusions do you draw about the geographical area that they have chosen?
There's one missing, basically. There was one bigger one that should have been there, and it isn't. Which should have at least encompassed the London and Birmingham airports as well.
Okay. And what do you think the consequence of that has been in their analysis?
The consequences are that it has confused the analysis, and it is difficult to isolate where new benefits are and where benefits are just being redistributed. And potentially we have got significant overclaims for the size of some of these benefits.
And those overclaims, if I've understood, and correct me if I'm wrong, those overclaims arise because they haven't taken into account the impact on those other wider areas. Have I understood your evidence correctly?
So two main issues here, but the principal one is that they have not accounted for the fact that while some passengers may fly through London and Birmingham airports, the benefits that accrue from their flying there remain in the study area, in the southwest, regardless of where they fly from, meaning that they have claimed that new benefits have been brought into the area when those benefits were actually already in the area.
Okay. Can you give an example of what you mean by that?
So again, it's this point about inbound tourism and also business productivity.
Thank you.
So if you have an inbound tourist who switches their airport from Heathrow to Bristol, the majority of their benefit was in Bristol, was in the southwest already, and it remains in the southwest.
So this is your evidence. They may stay one night at Heathrow and then travel to the West Country and spend the rest of their money locally.
So that the implications of that, if maybe we could go to the economic impact addendum and look at the kind of key table, which is 3.6 in the economic impact addendum. I can't remember what the core document number for that is. It's CD 2.22. Yeah, CD 2.22. We've been to this table a few times before now. So if we look at the far right jobs, full-time equivalents and GVA numbers, 50 million direct, 140 million productivity, 60 tourism. I noticed these were previously a sensitivity scenario. These are now our core estimates after the errata from York Aviation. Those have all had a displacement factor of 28% applied on the basis that that is the proportion of passengers who would fly from the southwest or South Wales anyway. But 28% is not the correct displacement rate to apply to tourism and productivity, because there's this other group of 34% of passengers who, in the case of tourism and productivity, do fly from other airports outside the region, but the benefit value, it remains in the region, or the majority of it does. Now, I'd like to kind of again endorse what Mr. Sorrow was saying about a range. The true range of displacement is between 28% and 62% on those figures. As I said, because of hotels in London and others, 62% may also be slightly too high, but the chances of it being 28% are virtually none. A conservative approach would have been to either present both estimates or to put something in the middle.
Thank you. I think these subjects essentially bleed into each other to some extent. If we move on to displacement then, and your evidence in relation to that, how should displacement have been approached in this case, do you think?
So, as I said, I'm not going to pass comment on the actual displacement model. I believe there might be still outstanding questions about that with the logic model. I don't, we didn't get into that. But what we do is say, let's take the appellant's assumptions and play them out to their logical conclusion. Now, the assumption if we take jobs, for example, the assumption in the appellant's case is that we have 28% of jobs that are displaced within the region from, say, Cardiff Airport, Exeter, Bournemouth, as we've discussed, to Bristol Airport as a result of this expansion. And the way that we get to that is, and this is key, we assume that if you, say, lose 100,000 passengers at Cardiff Airport, then you lose a number of jobs, say 50 jobs. And if you then transfer those 100,000 passengers to Bristol Airport, you regain that 50 jobs. So net zero change is effectively what we're saying. So passengers have just relocated, job numbers, jobs have relocated, but total number has not changed. Now, our issue with that assumption is that 100,000 passengers produces the same number of jobs at every airport. So, and we know that that is, broadly speaking, not true. We've discussed how many jobs Bristol Airport produces per million passengers, depending on what it varies by year, but it's typically in the range of about 450 jobs per million passengers. But we know from research that I've documented in my proof, that there's a range of different job intensities, if you like, at different airports. I've pointed to research that suggests that Cardiff Airport actually produces 900 jobs per million passengers, effectively double the number. So if you were to change the number of passengers by a set amount at Cardiff Airport, you would get a different response in job numbers to the response you would get at Bristol Airport. Now, in the case of Cardiff Airport, where it produces far more jobs, that means if you strip away, say, 1 million passengers from Cardiff Airport, you will lose a lot more jobs, potentially, than you would at Bristol Airport. Now, why are those differences there? I mean, there's a lot of different reasons. As we know, airports are optimized for different things. I understand from BBC News article that Bristol Airport recently automated some of their cleaning jobs and were on the news boasting about their new robot who does the cleaning. Well, of course, if Cardiff have not automated their cleaning jobs, then they will have a higher number of jobs per passenger. There's differences between airports. And we know there are differences. To assume that all of the job creation by airport is the same is actually to assume a situation we know is not true. Now, the sensitivity of that, is it 900 jobs, per million passengers that you would get if you were to reduce, the passengers at Cardiff by a certain amount? Yes, there is uncertainty there. There is a kind of, it's not a linear relationship. These airports have a fixed number of jobs that they need to maintain for certain services. We know other services are very dependent on passenger numbers. But we know that the assumption of the appellant is the best case scenario, that it's a one-to-one. We know that the worst case scenario is that you've got a whole series of airports who produce more jobs per passenger, losing more jobs, and then you result in a net negative jobs within the region. Now, we've presented an alternative estimate. I would put it as a model which is as credible as the appellant's, because it makes the opposite assumption, which is that the jobs will be lost at the rate appropriate to that airport, as opposed to the rate assumed at Bristol Airport. Again, the reality is probably in the range somewhere, as we've said, and that's why we should have a sensitivity test around this issue. But the I think, almost undoubtable conclusion is that the estimate for jobs is overstated as a result of that.
And to what extent is it overstated?
Up to 24%, we have estimated in our modelling.
And you're saying it's simply that analysis, because that analysis, which ought to have been done under the best practice tag guidance, etc.
Well, the interesting thing about this analysis is I think it links very much into the levelling up agenda. So I've referenced the Green Book review, which is in the core document list. So the Green Book review was conducted in 2020. I think it's CD 116.4. I found that in the CD PDF list, but I did struggle to find it on the actual web portal. But the Green Book review was conducted of the government's preeminent appraisal document, and looking at the alignment of that appraisal document with its strategic objectives around stopping climate change and levelling up. And the outcomes of that Green Book review can be read. It's quite a short document. I'd really recommend reading it. They put a lot of emphasis on analysing what they call differential impacts between places. So, to quote briefly, appraisers of proposals must consider the differential impacts on different places and the interaction with other relevant strategies at UK levels or more locally. This focuses minds on how to level up left behind places and help decision makers to see the likely effects of different options on specific geographical areas. And differential impacts is what I'm talking about here. I'm saying a change in passenger numbers at one airport does not produce the same outcome at another airport. And that matters when we consider what the ultimate impact on deprived communities, strategic levelling up objectives is in the South West and South Wales.
So Mr. Surat couldn't point to policy, but you can in relation to levelling up and how it's to be applied in decisions like this.
Indeed. Mr. Surat did say, I believe, in his cross-examination that he didn't think there was a policy in this area. I would say that the government's response to the Green Book review makes some pretty clear statements in regard to how that should be approached.
Okay. Is there anything else you'd like to say in relation to the displacement issue?
Now, so this kind of all these issues kind of intersect with each other. So there's obviously linkages between displacement and the outbound tourism issue. The first thing I would say is that the appellants, if we're going back to the economic impact addendum and that table, that the sort of the final output, table 3.6 has a line at the top, direct impacts, jobs. Those direct impacts could perhaps more appropriately be titled direct impacts or direct jobs in aviation and airports and their associated sectors. What we do not have in this, presented to us in this appraisal from the appellant, is a system or regional jobs assessment. At no point were the decision makers from North Somerset Council presented with evidence which says if you ran an analysis on the wide scale of all the sectors of the economy, this would be the change in jobs. What we have is a shift in jobs within the aviation sector. We've got jobs moving around within aviation. We've got creation of jobs in aviation through those new passengers. But then, of course, the final point about displacement, which we've just heard discussed with Jerome, we'll come back because it relates to outbound tourism. We've got displacement between non-aviation sectors and aviation. So people would have been spending their money on, a new car, a trip to the cinema locally, whatever it may be. And that activity then gets displaced into aviation and spending on air travel, which, as I say, kind of flows over into the outbound tourism issue. But I don't think that's emphasised enough. The fact that we are not seeing here job creation in a macro system scale. We are seeing it within one sector, and you cannot have confidence from just these numbers that there is actually job creation even within the local area, because of those other factors which are not in this about outflows from the area and outflows of spending.
Is there any significance to the nature of the main use of Bristol Airport in relation to that?
Absolutely. I mean, as I said before, and I think again can't be reiterated enough, this airport's main function is to move people from the region out on international outbound tourism. Overwhelmingly, 60+% of their passengers are for that purpose. Additionally, something like 80 to 85% of their passengers are UK residents on the move. the amount of inflow into the region is very small. And that's why, and I think the key point here is, there's a policy document from 2013 where the national government says, overall we're not like overly, I'm paraphrasing here, but we're not overly worried about incentivizing outbound tourism when we're developing our inbound tourism strategies. But let's bear in mind that at the national level, there's something like 1.7 outbound passengers for every one inbound. So the ratio, yes, it's still stacked, outwardly, but it's not as bad. But at Bristol, the ratio is over 5 to 1. This is the primary function of this airport. So to conduct a jobs assessment without any assessment of the loss of jobs in domestic sectors, whether that be regionally, people taking trips to Newquay, whether that be locally in your local Argos or whatever it may be, to conduct this assessment, this is not a complete assessment of the jobs in the local area or the study area at large.
Thank you. So you're not passing comment on the validity of people going on foreign holidays. You're just saying they haven't factored this into the jobs assessment in the local area for the inspectors to consider as part
Indeed.
of that economic impact of what's going on.
Yeah, I heard the conversation obviously from Mr. Humphreys and Mr. Thoreau. It is accepted that airports are capped. Every airport in the country has a cap on it. That's what that's just standard policy. That's not stopping people from leaving the UK. People can still get their flights. We have 300 million people leaving every year. That's fine. I hope to do that myself, as most of us probably do. But when we talk about expanding that capacity, it is essential that decision makers have the full information at their disposal to know whether they think this expansion of capacity, which is within their powers, is in the interests of the local area. And if they have a strategic view of incentivizing the local economic development, there's going to be a lot of talk over the next year or two about can we bring the domestic economy back up and running, can we get Weston-super-Mare back to its former glory, then they may well wish to adopt a policy which is, okay, let's not actively encourage more overseas travel. People still can travel, but let's not actively incentivize it. Let's actively incentivize other forms which retain wealth within the local economy.
And the ability to quantify the impact on jobs then in relation to that, is that something which is possible, or is that...
I think that's a good question. I think the appellant and the rebuttal from Mr. Brass have made it sound very, very difficult. I would make 2 points about that. First of all, this is only really a reversal of the calculation of inbound tourists. It could be as simple as that. At least if we're interested in getting an indicative estimate of roughly what the losses to outbound tourism may be, we've provided something on that. Mr. Thoreau has provided something on that. It can be done. Now, admittedly, there will be uncertainties, of course, and I would welcome seeing the appellant put forward a range of estimates in that regard, identifying those uncertainties. But to just assume zero, when this is the primary function of your airport, outbound international tourism, that, for me, that goes completely contrary to the Green Book and TAG in terms of understanding key impacts. You can't ignore your main impact and not attempt to quantify it when there are ways of doing it.
Just following the sequence in your proof, rather than going on to other things, I think you in your proof, paragraph 7, you make some observations about business productivity and the assumptions that have been made in relation to that. Would you like to provide your assessment of I suppose, where we are from the inspector's point of view and the roadmap forward?
I apologise that we're coming back to this again. I'm sure everyone's sick to death of all this conversation now, but I do think there are some important points in my analysis of this which can add to this discussion. So, as I've said, business productivity is core to the appellant's case. They're around 45% on their impact table that we just discussed in economic impact addendum, come from business productivity. And there's two different factors that you have to consider when calculating that. One is, are there going to be any business passengers in the first place? And the second is, if there are, what kind of benefit do they generate? Now, in the appellant's case, we rely on two elasticities to generate those two estimates. We have the DFT's business passenger elasticity, which tells you, okay, if you've got a certain amount of GDP growth and other factors, prices, incomes and things, how many business passengers will you get? And then you go back the other way, which is all feels a bit bizarre, but you go, okay, so you've got these numbers of business passengers. We need another elasticity to say how much is the economic growth that's going to result from that, or productivity. And that comes to this Oxford economics elasticity, which is the fundamental core of the method. Now, those elasticities are really critical in determining the numbers that you get. And my first point on that is, as a result of how critical they are, they definitely should have been subjected to testing. We should have had multiple scenarios looking at different elasticities to see. Now, particularly because those two elasticities were calibrated, if you like, against very old data. So the one which tells you how many passengers you're going to have, the DFT's elasticity, was calibrated from 1984 to 2008. And the Oxford Economics one was calibrated from 1980 to 2010. So the first thing that I would note from those two date ranges is that neither of them have got any meaningful assessment of what happened after the financial crisis of 2007 and 8. And I would also highlight that both of those periods cover a period in our economic development which is very helpfully shown in Mr. Brass's globalization index figure, which if people want to go back to it, we can. We've seen it before. I might as well I'll get it up just so that people can check. Globalization index. So it's the figure 15, page 53 of Mr. Brass's forecasting proof of evidence. And it shows, globalization in the UK economy from 1970 to 2018. And what you see is a surge in globalization between about 1992 and I want to say about 2002. And since then, marginal increase. Before that point, obviously a little bit of plateau and then a large rise. But the point is that these two elasticities have been calibrated during a very different period of the UK's economic development when globalization of the economy was surging. And we are not in that phase anymore.
1992, significance of that date, I think we've heard in relation to changes structurally in the UK anyway, in the EU.
Yeah, indeed.
That period of time, any other observations on that in relating to air travel?
So now it is true that throughout this whole period, as Mr. Brass points out, there has been a growth in use of video conferencing or teleconferencing and other factors. That is, there is an underlying rate of growth, but that is not on any level at all close to what we've been seeing, especially in the last 2 years. I mean, my random example, but I recently upgraded my internet connection to 900 megabits a second, which is, thousands of times faster than would have been possible during 1990 to 2000. Probably tens of thousands. I can't do the maths off the top of my head. The possibilities have come on dramatically since then. And that, again, really, really matters, because if we talk about that second elasticity, let's talk about the Oxford economics one, what that describes is what is the relative merit of the business traveller flying versus the next best option. And we're saying back then it was big. There was a good reason to do that trip. Your marginal gain was significant because the alternatives were not so good. We have all the problems with dodgy connections, dial-up or whatever it was at the time, lack of face-to-face. But now the differential between your relative productivity you can achieve just by staying home and doing it online, and the improvement you get from that going face-to-face has shrunk very considerably. And that I would argue that was unfolding in the last 10 years, before the crisis as well. But obviously very much so in the last year and a half.
Just in relation to that, I think paragraph 7.1.6 in your proof of evidence, you make reference to your research into airlines' approach to that subject.
Yeah, indeed. So Mr. Soror, I think, put forward some other things, a poll and others. I spent a couple of days trawling the internet to see what people had to say on this. And I've collated, quite a number of references here to talk about the fact that remote working from home is here to stay. But perhaps more importantly, airline executives, Star Alliance, Delta, Lufthansa, all saying we expect long-term business passenger declines, range of 10 to 30%. Now, and I've also pointed to an aviation sector consultancy as well, who interestingly received most of their commissions from the aviation sector, and they were still confident to make this point. I think the key point to make here is, I think in his rebuttal, Mr. Brass said, well, you would say that during the peak of the crisis, during the worst period, you would be more worried during that period. But I think it's really critical to remember that these, industry figures are not doing this without any information. We know what happened after the 2007 to 8 financial crisis. And one thing that I've actually surprised that we've not heard said enough in this inquiry so far is that at the UK level, business travellers at an absolute level never recovered from the 2007-8 crisis. They never got back. So that's in the McKinsey reference that I provided. It's just an online link. It's there in the proof. But it can also be calculated from the Civil Aviation Authority's data. Now, that's interesting because...
So this is from the period, which period of time have you looked at?
So at this point, it might be useful to jump to my rebuttal statement and section 2 on business impacts. So I've highlighted here that now the problem with the Civil Aviation Authority data, which we've been bashing our heads against the whole week, is that they only survey local regional airports on an irregular basis. But they do survey the larger airports, Gatwick, Heathrow, Luton, Manchester, Stansted, every single year. And what we can detect from that is that 2006 was the peak business travel in absolute terms in the UK. Now that's meaningful for a lot of reasons, and the first point is that the data suggests business travel has never returned to that level. That's interesting because, as Mr. Brass identified in his forecasting evidence, he regards the financial crisis to have ended in 2012. So why then did business passengers not return to pre-crisis levels in 2012? In fact, why did they never return to that level? The only thing that you can conclude from that is that the previous relationship between economic parameters, GDP, and business travel broke somewhere along the way. And that elasticity that we were using from the DFT to tell us how many business passengers we should have, which was calibrated against ancient data at that point, is no longer valid. And you know what, the DFT know this. We've had the quote presented from the Jet Zero evidence where they, bizarrely, having used this forecasting, they then say, but this is probably out of date. Now, can I just translate that into what it means for the debate that we had about this, between Jacobs and Mr. Humphreys, about the, should we look at Bristol's situation between 2008, 2019, 2015, all those issues? Fundamentally, because Bristol Airport was not surveyed in 2006, the year of peak business travel, we do not know what the peak was at Bristol Airport in terms of absolute numbers. At least I haven't seen that. I mean, maybe the airport themselves have those numbers. Apologies if that's the case, but I've not seen that presented anywhere. So I would hazard a guess, it is a guess, an educated one nonetheless, based on the rest of the country, that was the peak year. So we do not know, therefore, whether even 2019's higher numbers are even a recovery. Have we even recovered to where we were in 2006? Nationally, we haven't. So there's a reasonable chance that locally we haven't as well. So it may well be that there has been no business passenger growth in the last 15 years at Bristol Airport? Well, we don't know. And just to add a little bit of extra information to that, just to help the argument, in 2.19 of my rebuttal, I just went to a few other regional airports that were surveyed in years that are maybe better proxies.
I'm sorry, which paragraph?
2.1.9 of my rebuttal,
Thank you.
and the table below that. So I went into Civil Aviation Authority's data, and I tried to find, situations where you could get business passenger numbers pre the financial crisis. Now, there's two there from 2006 and two from 2005, because there wasn't a huge amount of 2006 data, but 2005 was also a year of high business traveller numbers. And then they were then next resurveyed in 2010, 2009. And you see the declines that I've listed there, 12%, 40%, 18%, 11%. If you were to look at the numbers that Mr. Brass has presented in his table, and I will try to get that table reference for you. It's in the forecasting evidence for Mr. Brass. That comes from page 52, figure 14, Mr. Brass's forecasting. So where in this figure is the financial crisis hit? Well, it's not represented in 2008 because that's already depressed numbers by the financial crisis. That was the chaos year. Numbers were way down in terms of travellers there. So there's probably there's a bit of data we're missing between 2003 and 2008, which was our peak business travellers. As I say, we don't know what that number is, but between 2008 and 2012, that you see the 0.84 to 0.8, well, that's about a 5% decline. So maybe we could say that that was a partial impact of the crisis we're seeing there, maybe because obviously it did rumble on until 2012. But the other airports, as I've shown in my rebuttal, were seeing way more than 5%. They were seeing at minimum 11%. East Midlands saw 40% decline. So on that basis, a conservative assumption, and that's the business that we should be making, is that 2006, 2005, Bristol Airport had a lot more business passengers. It lost a lot more passengers than we've been speculating here, and it has not recovered anywhere near as quickly. Maybe it has, maybe it hasn't, we don't know. But a safe assumption, given that we've now had another crisis that has driven people away from business travel, you have to make the assumption from that conservatively that there are not any new business passengers to be had.
Thank you. I just want to move on to the next paragraph 8 in your proof, which is tourism. I think in part you've probably covered some of this in the displacement discussion. Do you want to just check that there's nothing that you want to add to your evidence in relation to that?
I think I mostly covered it. I mean, the key points are that the government guidance says that you have to be looking at the main material impacts of a scheme. That needs to be done quantitatively, or you're just ignoring a significant risk. We can debate more extensively if Mr. Humphreys wants. The small factors that might mitigate that. That the issues around welfare. But I think the point stands, regardless of all those ins and outs, that this is a preeminent impact of this scheme. You can get a quantitative estimate of it. You should present a range. We've given an estimate, and that should, for me, has to be factored into the economic appraisal. I don't think there's a huge amount more to say on that.
Thank you. Then turning on to paragraph 9, the subject of environmental impacts.
Oh, sorry, just to add on that. I mean, in my proof, I did this claim and counterclaim just to highlight some of those issues. So if people want to read into some of those question marks about calculating outbound tourism, they can do. Sorry, on chapter 9, environmental impacts, yeah.
In relation to an evaluation which is a full economic evaluation of the proposal, what environmental impacts ought to have been taken into account?
Carbon, air quality and noise should all have been monetised and included in the welfare-based social cost-benefit analysis.
Right. And has that been done?
Noise and air quality have not been included, and there's detailed methodologies as to how they should be monetised in the Department for Transport's guidance.
So again, getting back to the best practice tag analysis approach to this matter, whether it's formally required or not, you would have expected to see that.
Yeah, and I would have expected to see the carbon costed using high carbon prices. Now, I believe, as I think Mr. Saroy was getting at when he responded here, it's kind of hard to tell exactly what the price was set by the appellant, but I can say with great confidence that it is the central carbon prices, because we ran the numbers and you can see our estimates in the proof, and our central number for the departing passengers is very similar to the appellant's. However, as I've said, as the DFT were very clear in 2020 with their tag route map and their guidance on updates to tag, and as you can see why they did this, because of what's happened with the Transport Decarbonisation Plan and Jet Zero, you must be using high, or at least presenting a scenario with high carbon prices. So if we're looking at the appellant's assessment, they're missing around about 50% of their carbon price is off there, but we can go a lot further than that. In fact, we should, if we're to take a cautious estimate and a responsible approach to monetising climate risk, we should also be looking at the issue of non-CO2 impacts. So as we know, and as will come up extensively, I imagine, in the climate change week of this inquiry, carbon is only part of the picture of how aviation impacts on climate change. Now, what you'll see in my table 14 is our full range of scenarios of carbon impact. Now, as a result of the DFT's positions, I'm looking at the high price column. Now we've got just the base departures there at 459 million, and we used the appellant's high demand scenario to get 492 million cost. However, BEI's Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy provide a multiplier that they recommend for business carbon accounting, which is 1.9, to get to your figure for the total climate impact. So that is to go from carbon, including in all your other gases that are emitted, to say what is the total monetized cost of emissions. And you look at the third row there and the fourth row, depending on which scenario, high or central demand, you end up with 869 million or 931 million. Now, if you were to take those numbers across to the appellant's overall welfare net present value, you would see it getting very significantly eroded by those two changes, which are demonstrated very clearly to be best practice in government guidance. This is not speculative stuff.
So you haven't, just to understand that the Bristol, the appellant's figures, you've calculated from your own calculation of the way they've advanced it to have taken the middle price of carbon.
Yeah, that's it. So because we can see in our central price just the expansion, 298 million, and at the very bottom, the 262 million, I believe, is the appellant's number, but they've factored that down a bit because they've included some carbon offsetting of the airport's emissions. The numbers are similar enough that I'm pretty sure that means it's the central carbon price that they've used there.
Now, I just want, that's looking at the costing of the impact of carbon and other greenhouse gases and emissions. There has been an observation about whether there's open and free competition within, as between airports and airline operators. Do you have any observations in relation to that and any support that is given?
I'm not sure I understood. Could you rephrase?
I'm thinking of the subject matter of the emissions trading system.
Yeah. So the current landscape of carbon pricing is that when we run our forecasts, and this comes also back to the question that Mr. Humphreys was putting to Mr. Serow about aren't those prices already internalised? Now, you run a forecast model and you have a set of carbon prices that you put into that forecast model. Those prices are theoretical, but you do it because it's expected at some future date that those carbon costs will become real and they will translate into ticket prices. The issue is, and the reason why it's still so vital to also then include your economic values of carbon, is that presently most of those costs of carbon in current legislation are theoretical. We're still waiting for the legislation which has now been hinted at in the Jet Zero review, so this could change, to be made realised. And let me just explain that because it's probably a bit of an odd one. So we have the ETS, which puts a carbon cap on aviation, but up until, currently, 82% of credits under ETS are given away for free. Now that is expected to start to decline at some point, but that means there is no actual tangible cost to the airline of those 82% credits. They're not paying any carbon cost on those. So what that is effectively saying is this carbon is still being emitted and someone is still going to pay that price, but the government is, or the public, is subsidising that for now. We are subsidising that cost. So that's why that cost has to be included in our economic assessment. If the government's going to offer that subsidy, we need to have it in there. In addition, of course, ETS only applies to European flights. We've also got non-European flights. But CORSIA is scheduled in theory to play a role in that. But CORSIA also has no direct carbon cost on UK flights as it stands, and it's very unlikely to have any direct carbon cost on UK flights moving forward. The reason for that is, and I expect this will come up again in the Climate Change Week, but the reason for that is that CORSIA only charges on emissions above a 2018-19 threshold, and those emissions are we're not likely to pass that threshold, at least not anytime soon, and hopefully we won't, because hopefully emissions are going to be falling. So that means you're going to have this event where there's going to be international flights going out of going globally that are not charged under CORSIA because emissions are falling and not passing their level, but emissions are still being made and they're not being charged. And that's why in the Jet Zero consultation and the Transport Decarbonisation Plan, you'll see a quote, and let me just get that for you. So the Jet Zero, there's a lot of them. So Transport Decarbonisation Plan assumes on page 127, application will come along at some point of a universal carbon price on all flights. They have to state that because that's not currently the case. Jet Zero consultation sees carbon pricing as an essential lever to reaching net zero, and says they plan to strengthen, and this is obviously a policy proposal in the consultation, to strengthen carbon pricing for aviation to ensure we continue to apply the polluter pays principle, page 37. The reason that needs to be there is because, as I say, there's a whole bunch of loopholes which currently mean carbon prices which we put in our forecast model are just theoretical. They're there just for the models to anticipate. They're not real, and until they are real, they are being subsidised by the public, either through the public later having to recapture those emissions, through capture technologies or nature. But if we don't recapture them, which is also possible, then it's a social cost. It's a cost in the experience of flooding, of extreme heats, as we've seen in recent years. That is a direct and financially monetizable cost to society if those emissions are not captured. So that's why it's essential that at least until the policies change, we continue to include that in our cost-benefit analysis in the economic assessment. And of course, this is all supported by government guidance. This is set out very clearly in TAG. In fact, TAG states, when you do this, we want you to show not just the cost of carbon, but we want you to break it down between the ones that are covered under ETS, emissions trading system, and the ones that aren't. And of course, a final bit, I'm sorry, then I'll shut up, that really we also need to not forget is those non-CO2 emissions, which can be potentially almost double the impact. under all scenarios at the moment as it stands, there are no plans to charge a tangible carbon price to airlines or airports on those non-CO2 emissions. So they exist, they take place, and they have a cost to society. That's why we need to use the multiplier, and we need to have them in our cost-benefit analysis as well. And the multiplier is provided by BEIS and is recommended for use by the Department for Transport.
And has that, do you think, been adequately done in this case?
No. Indeed, I think that in the absence of these numbers, we are exposing ourselves to risk. And I can see why a decision maker would be concerned about that in the context of a climate crisis.
Moving then on to section 10 in your proof of evidence, which is a socio-economic cost-benefit analysis. It may well be we've covered a lot of this in your other evidence. Do you want to just check that there isn't anything you want to add in relation to that subject?
So this is an attempt to bring what you might call a more sort of welfare-based cost-benefit analysis. You know, the tables that we spoke about before with the direct jobs and the business productivity are more of a sort of macroeconomic kind of GDP-style analysis, we call it. And here we're now talking more about welfare. And this is an area that the New Economics Foundation has done a lot of work on over the last 20 to 30 years, developing methodologies that government has adopted, such as social return on investment and others. I struggled a lot with this figure because there's a lot of stuff in there that I found very confusing, non-standard, misleading or missing. To highlight some of the key points, obviously the high carbon price is a huge one. The lack of including air quality and noise impacts is an important one. But there's a lot of other stuff here that I couldn't fully understand. I thank Mr. Brass for trying to clarify some of this in his rebuttal, but I didn't really come away from that rebuttal better understanding what was going on. So, choice of stakeholders. We've got airport profits, but I looked at what the DFT do when they assess airport expansion. I looked at the example of the Heathrow appraisal report that was put to Parliament, and they also included, I don't think they included airport profits, but they included airline losses, which were created by the competition that the expansion of the airport created, and they're not in this assessment. We also noticed that the wrong discount rate appears to be used. It's a 3.5% rate continuously through the assessment period, whereas the Treasury's recommended rate is 3.5% for the first, I can't remember how many years, like 20 years or something, and then moving down to 3% for years beyond that. That doesn't have a massive impact, but it does result in slight marginal changes in some of the impacts. I had concerns which I flagged about reciprocal costs and benefits. So if there's a saving to the passenger in the form of airfare savings, then it would usually follow that there might be a loss to someone else somewhere along the chain, either the airport or the airline. As I say, based on looking at DFT's other studies, it seems to be the airline that is therefore missing in that case. There's technicalities around the consumer surplus there, which I won't go into. There's a tax estimate, which is the APD to government that would accrue from this project, except my issue with that is that aviation actually has a very generous tax arrangement. It is exempt from VAT and fuel duty. So if you were to compare the spending on aviation and how much tax that will produce with spending on any other sector, not any other sector, but many other sectors on an average basis, you would see those other sectors producing usually more tax than aviation does. So I was confused as to how aviation could produce a net tax benefit. If it's a sector that you would spend your money on, it's a sector that will produce less tax than the alternative usually. So that confused me. Surface access costs, are they included there? That's normally a standard part of this. As I say, it might accrue to the DFT or to the local authority. There's a figure in there of 61 million. which seems to be the cost that the airport will incur of building the new infrastructure, but I wasn't clear whether the costs to the public of building the new access routes and things was included. I'd hazard a guess not, because 61 million is quite low, and I understand the upgrades to the roads are likely to be tens of millions. Overall, I just can't see how you can arrive at this being credible. Now, to my discredit, I could have sat down with Mr. Brass and gone through this line after line and worked all the way around it, but there would have been, I think, so much to get through there. I didn't just think it was a good use of time, ultimately, I have to say.
Okay. Thank you. In relation to the points you've covered and the rebuttal, are there any other points you want to raise in relation to that?
So I'd like to quickly touch on the issue of a distributional impact assessment. Now, in a time of strategic priorities around levelling up, distributional impact assessment has been elevated in importance by the government, and that's demonstrated in the Green Book review that I mentioned earlier. Now, obviously that is saying that we should be asking the question, not just are there benefits, but to whom do they accrue? Now, actually going back to what we just discussed, the socio-economic cost-benefit analysis and Mr. Brass's key table on figure on that, what we also need to know is when we look at the airfare savings that are presented in that graph, which are the primary benefits, the DFT, their distributional impact assessment would ask the question, to whom are those accruing? Now, the simple answer to that is we don't know, because it's not been questioned. But the risk is that we know that air travel is a sector which is overwhelmingly used by the wealthiest in society. It's a stat that's been widely touted. It's 70% of flights are taken by 15% of people. That's publicly available all over the place. I mean, if you want me to send the reference for it, I can. I think it was checked on full fact as well. So I think we can have, or at least our starting position for this assessment should be that the majority of those airfare savings are going to be for wealthy, frequent flyers who are using the airport for leisure trips multiple times. So when Mr. Humphreys earlier was challenging Mr. Serow, saying, for example, there's a welfare benefit here, and first of all, it's far smaller than he was making out, because as Mr. Serow pointed out, that welfare benefit is a differential between what they spent the money on, what they would have spent it on otherwise, and the airfare. But we also need to know to whom does that benefit accrue, and if we are strategically aiming to level up, then we should put more weight on a scheme which is delivering for the least well-off. And there may be possibilities that that's the case, but the assessment has not been done, so we don't know.
Is there anything else you'd like to add?
So there is one section of my proof that we've not done the detail on, but some people might not thank me to go through it, but that's on Mr. Brass's and I's to and fro about the Oxford economics business productivity elasticity and whether it's appropriate. To summarise my conclusions, that's the one that takes you from business passengers to actual benefits to the economy. To summarise my position on that, it is when the elasticity used is so out of date, it is by two financial crises, financial and a pandemic, and as a result of changes in behaviour, and we've got this evidence about the decoupling of GDP from business travel. There should at least have been a range presented. We should have had one higher end elasticity and one lower end. And I've pointed in my proof to an example as far back as 2013, when Oxford Economics themselves, the authors of this elasticity estimate, were doing just that. They were presenting the one that's been used by the appellant, and they were presenting another one, which was a much lower, 7 times lower, in fact, from another report. And I don't comment too much on the veracity of those two estimates. As I say, they're out of date, but the point was the principle of how you should present it. And that is also borne out in other Department for Transport analyses and how they've approached that issue. Again, our approach to uncertainty here has not been adequate. There has to be, we can't have a single core scenario prediction of the future and nothing else. We must have a range. And I think there is a very, very strong case to say that either through the lack of business travellers or the lack of evidence to suggest they will actually deliver productivity uplifts, you have to assume that the business productivity uplift is zero from this expansion.
Thank you, Dr. Chapman. Unless you have anything further to add,
I'll shut up now.
I will stop there.
Okay, let's take a 45-minute break. We'll come back at 1 o'clock. Thank you.